Russia is a great power that made an immense contribution to world science, technology, culture, and sports. It is a country with a remarkable and dramatic history, and it all began like this. In 6th to 7th centuries, Slavic tribes moved from the extensive plains of Eastern Europe to the Don and Dnieper valleys of the northern Black Sea coast. These were agrarian pagan tribes that worshipped the sun, lightning, and wind. The banks of the Dnieper were a hospitable location for habitation. During those distant times, the well-known trade route from the Varangians to the Greeks ran through here. Gradually, cities began to form: Kiev, Chernigov, Novgorod. The tribal leaders and princes were engaged in affairs that were not unusual for that period of history, the early Middle Ages. They waged war with their neighbors, the nomadic Pecheng and Khajar tribes. They fought each other and ruthlessly oppressed and robbed their subjects. The level of conflict and civil strife became more and more pronounced, and the Novgorod elders turned to the Varangians as the ancestors of modern Norwegians and Swedes were called back then, with the words, "Our land is great and plentiful, but there is no order in it. Come rule and reign over us." 3 Varangian princes, Cineas, Truvor, and Rurik, undertook to put things in order. The new princes managed to restore a more or less comprehensible order, and in essence, they founded the state of Rus at that time. And the Varangian Slavic people occupying these lands at the time came to be called Russian. Rurik became the founder of the Rurikid dynasty, which ruled Russia for many centuries. After the death of Rurik, power passed for some time to his son's guardian Oleg, who captured Kiev and made it capital of Russia, after which the Russian state came to be called Kievan Rus. This state became so strong that Oleg's war party conquered the capital of Byzantium, Constantinople, or Russian Tsargrad as it was called. Only then did he conclude a peace treaty with the Greeks and Byzantines. After Oleg's death, Rurik's son Igor ruled for a short time before he was killed by those of his subjects rebelling against unreasonable requisitions. The Drevlians, a neighboring tribe, Igor's wife Olga savagely avenged the death of her husband on the Drevlians.
Сжечь город! И насыпать высокую могилу Игорю.
She was generally a very enlightened ruler and even accepted Christianity, for which she was later ranked among the holiest of saints. Paganism did not suit Kievan Rus anymore, since it was now a rather strong and modern state. There was a need to choose a monotheistic religion. Vladimir, the Prince of Kiev and Olga's grandson, was presented with a choice of 3 religions. The choices were Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, which was professed by the rules of the Khazar kingdom, which was powerful at the time. Prince Vladimir made a historical choice. He chose Orthodoxy, the religion of Byzantium. And this choice was fateful for Russia for its entire further existence. The baptism of Russia, which began in 988, was not easy. The most persistent keepers of the pagan faith were killed. Many were baptized with fire and sword, so to speak. The most persistent pagans were simply mercilessly destroyed, but most pagans took to the new religion easily enough. In Russian history, Tsar Vladimir's reign is considered a light and joyful page and the best time of Kievan Rus. After Vladimir's death, his numerous sons plunged almost immediately into a most severe struggle for power. For some time, Vladimir's illegitimate son Yaroslav, named without justification as Yaroslav the Wise, occupied the throne. He created the first code of laws, Russian truth, patronized architects and icon painters, and adhered to a reasonable foreign policy.
Мира желаю Византии и Руси. И всем желаю жить в мире.
These were the last fruitful years of Kievan Rus. Already after Yaroslav, his sons and grandsons became rulers one after another. The country broke up into a set of small and large princedoms. Historians agree that Kievan Rus ceased to exist in the 12th century. At this time, the outstanding commander Genghis Khan formed a powerful military force in the territory of Mongolia, Siberia, and northern China. He managed to forge an army from the nomad tribes of Mongols. This army had strict organization, iron discipline, and unprecedented siege technology. It swept over the open spaces of Asia in a deadly wave and moved onto Europe. Despite the desperate resistance of some Russian princes, the Mongol-Tatar hordes conquered the entire territory of Russia, sowing death, the smoke of large fires, and violence everywhere. Grief and fear spread over the Russian plains. Nevertheless, despite all the cruelty, the Tatar-Mongolian conquerors eventually manifested quite reasonable management methods. They left the princes who were loyal to them in power and did not persecute the Orthodox Church, which remained the guardian of culture and the main unifying factor for Russian people. Novgorod prince and military leader Alexander Nevsky, even given his vassal dependence on the Golden Horde and continuing to pay a tribute, managed to prevail over armies of a Catholic knightly order twice, on the banks of the Neva and on the ice of Lake Chutska. Prince Alexander Nevsky was subsequently canonized, and he is considered a patron saint of Russia. And here, imperceptibly in the beginning, the small Moscow princedom, under control of clever and prudent princes, was gradually to become the center of gravity among other Russian lands. In general, from the date of its founding, the city-state of Moscow consistently expanded over many centuries, annexing more and more new lands. The princedom of Moscow, in the course of time, got so strong that Prince Dmitry, the grandson of Moscow's first prince Ivan Kolity, managed to raise an army of many thousands and to set it against a detachment of Tatars headed by Mamai, a rebellious commander from the Golden Horde. The ensuing battle on the banks of the Don, on Kulkovo Field, turned into a terribly bloody slaughter and ended with victory for the Russian war party. And even though Russia continued to pay tribute to the Tatar conquerors for many years afterward and was still a vassal state, the victory at Kulkovo Field had the most profound historical value. It revealed the rising power of Russia and the capability of winning against the Tatars in open battle. In general, for the 2 centuries of the yoke, as the Tatar-Mongolian occupation subsequently came to be called, Russia certainly appreciably lost all connections with the West, as though it had stopped on the historical path. So the eternal east-west pendulum of Russian history swung sharply towards the east. In the 15th century, Ivan III, named the Great by his contemporaries, came to lead the Moscow princedom. During his rule, Russia stopped paying tribute to the Tatar conquerors. The city-state of Moscow released itself from more of 200 years of colonial dependence from the Tatar yoke practically without a fight. Ivan was married to Sofia Palilog, the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, and he adopted the Byzantine two-headed eagle as the state emblem of Russia. During his rule, relations with Europe were established. European, particularly Italian architects and builders came to Russia and together with the Russian Duchy, or architect, built the Moscow Kremlin. At last, there was the idea of a Russian state. It was confirmed by the historical reality and reflected in the minds of the country's citizens, who came to understand that their country is Russia, and not only as the country of the Russians, but also, given the fall of the Byzantine Empire, the center of world orthodoxy. The years of rule of Ivan IV, who assumed the throne in 1547, were one of the most inconsistent and bloody pages in Russian history.
Ныне впервые великий князь Московский, венец царя всея Руси, на себя возлагает. И тем навеки многовластию злокозненному, боярскому на Руси предел кладет. Отныне русской земле единой быть.
On one hand, the Tsar carried out necessary reforms. He drafted a new code of laws, the Code of 1550, put the tax system in order, created a well-trained Strelets army, and as a result of successful wars, expanded the state borders. In particular, he annexed Kazan, Astrakhan, and the Siberian realm, but he received the name which entered into world history, Ivan the Terrible, the bloody tyrant, distinguishing himself with extreme cruelty. An atmosphere of palace intrigues, treachery, and murder in combination with mental illness made the Tsar, as often happens to tyrants, afflicted simultaneously with a persecution complex and sadism. He saw enemies and traitors everywhere, and he executed these mostly falsely accused enemies in the most refined ways. Ivan the Terrible created a personal army, the so-called oprichniki. These were young men dressed completely in black, with a broom and dog's head tied to their saddles, symbolizing a dog's loyalty and a readiness to sweep treason out of the country. During the day, they beheaded the Tsar's enemies, stoking terror among the people, and at night they feasted in the close company of the Tsar. The oprichniki's primary victims were the families of the boyars, descendants of many ancient noble bloodlines, and the populations of entire towns were decimated. The cruelty of the terrible Tsar knew no bounds. The entire country was drenched in blood and lived in constant fear. In a fit of rage, the Tsar killed his eldest son with a blow from a staff.
Подобает всегда царю осмотрительным быть. Ко благим милость и кротость, злым же ярость и мученье.
After the death of Ivan IV, his weak-willed and irresolute son Fyodor ascended to the throne. The country was actually ruled by Boris Godunov, the boyar and close advisor of the last Russian Tsars from the Rurikid dynasty, which ended with Fyodor's death. Having ascended to the throne already in the late 16th century, Boris Godunov became the official Tsar in Russia. Boris Godunov ruled fairly and tried to reform life in Russia, to set it on a European path. It was Russia's historical chance to make a decisive push towards civilization. But reformers are never loved in Russia.
Я творил им житницы, я злато рассыпал им, я им сыскал работы. Они ж меня, беснуясь, проклинали. Пожарный огник дом истребил. Я выстроил им новое жилище. Они ж меня пожаром упрекали. Вот черный суд, ищишь ее любви.
The country was rife with various rumors, sometimes of the most improbable kind, concerning Ivan the Terrible's youngest son Dmitri, who died in infancy. The Poles, who for a long time wanted to seize part of Russia's lands and expand their influence in the east, decided to take advantage of the situation. In Poland, a person appeared who proclaimed himself to be the miraculously healed Tsarevich Dmitri. On the way from Poland to Moscow, false Dmitri was met with the rejoicing and support of people dissatisfied with the rule of Godunov. False Dmitri entered Moscow in 1605. The so-called Time of Troubles began. It was a time of anarchy and lawlessness that rivaled the despotism of Ivan the Terrible. Moscow was flooded with Poles, and eventually the people revolted. False Dmitri, who had not even ruled for a year, was overthrown and executed. Vasily Shuisky, descendant of a well-known boyar bloodline, was declared Tsar. Immediately afterward, a peasant revolt swept the country. The weak power of the new Tsar generated new aspirants to the throne supported by various forces. Cossack groups that had been called to protect the country's borders came to Moscow and also joined the struggle for power. Poles, Cossacks, Swedes, and many other groups tried to take control of the Russian state. The patience of Russian people eventually gave out, and the nation rallied in the face of external and internal threats. Nizhny Novgorod's ruler Kozmo Minin and the Prince Dmitry Pozarsky raised a new national guard and set forth from Novgorod to Moscow, where they expelled all interventionists and assisted in the selection of the new Russian Tsar, Mikhail, from the boyar bloodline of the Romanovs. So a new dynasty of Russian monarchs was born. During the rule of Mikhail Romanov and that of his son Tsar Alexei, the Russian people were granted a respite of peace. In the last third of the 17th century, Russia attained political stability, a certain degree of economic well-being, and even expanded the borders. In its Christian beliefs and history, mainly that of the Kievan Rus period, Russia was a European power with a lifestyle that was rather more Asian. The people in their Slavish position deprived of civil rights, and the nobles and aristocrat boyars were more readily reminiscent of Asians. Certainly, there were educated boyars who knew languages. There were Russian diplomats who, upon returning home, told about life in Europe, but they were precious few of them. Most boyars were poorly educated, lazy, not interested in changing anything in their lives, and saw the West as a threat to their well-being. In order to survive and take a worthy place amongst the nations of the world, Russia needed rapid modernization, and as though obeying the call of history, a person appeared whom one can readily call a genius. This was Tsar Peter I, who came to be called Peter the Great. He was of gigantic stature, possessed of unrestrained energy, and a set of talents in various areas of human endeavor. He identified his purpose in life as the advancement of Russia to the status of a leading European power. In his youth, he spent a lot of time in the small enclave of Europeans in Moscow. He probably already understood at the time how much Russia was lagging behind Europe and decided on a radical restructuring of Russian life. He acted bravely, decisively, and even cruelly.
Мы моря хотим воевать. Полагаем счастье нашей страны в успехах морской торговли, а сие благословение Господне. Без иноземцев мне в военном и морском деле никак нельзя. А попробуй тронь их кирки до костела, они все разбегутся. Это что же? Крылья мне подшибаете!
After the death of the father, Tsar Alexei, his sister Sophia ascended to the throne. Her principal support was the Streltsy divisions, the self-styled guardians of the traditional order. Peter dealt with them very severely, and even personally beheaded some of them in an area near the Moscow Kremlin that came to be called Red Square. So the throne and the method to struggle against barbarity were attained with barbaric methods. In the struggle with the conservatives clinging to old traditions, their ways of life and the boyar opposition, he did not even regret executing his own son Alexei. Peter was cruel only to those who hindered the implementation of his overarching idea, to put Russia abreast of the leading European countries. Peter totally changed life in Russia. It's simply amazing that one person, even an autocrat, was able to do so much in a relatively short period of time. He went to Europe together with a large retinue, which he forced to study trades, engineering, and marine business, economy and customs. He sent the sons of noblemen to Europe for training.
Но с сыном теперь простись. Ничего не пожалеешь. Скоро за графами буду жаловать.
Peter ordered boyars to shave their beards, ladies to dress in low-necked dresses and hold European-style balls. Elite society and the ruling class was completely transformed, even outwardly. Peter himself worked for a time as carpenter under an assumed name in order to master shipbuilding. With the aid of young merchants, he created a new industry providing the army with weapons. He waged wars with the Swedes, the Turks, and with the Swedes again, in order to annex new territories and mainly to provide Russia with access to the sea. After all, until that time, the Russian state did not have any ports in the Baltic or Black Seas. Having failed in the first years of his rule in the war with Turkey, Peter was not fazed. He started a war with the Swedes and won access to the Baltic Sea. In addition, on a wild patch of Baltic seashore where there were only woods and bogs, he built the new capital of the Russian Empire, St. Petersburg, which became the window to Europe. Peter's associates, the baby birds of Peter's nest, not only built a new city which was no less beautiful than leading European capitals, but also carried out Peter's dream to build a Russian navy, then create a modern army using Swedish and German experts. Peter has an absolutely special place in Russian history, having been just about the only successful reformer. He left an absolutely new country after his reign. Russian history is now divided into two periods, pre-Petrine Russia and post-Petrine Russia. After Peter's death, there came the so-called century of palace revolutions. Rulers were enthroned by palace guards. In the beginning, Peter's wife, Yekaterina, became the empress. Then, power passed to his grandson Peter, to Tsarevich Peter Alexievich, who ruled for only 3 years. And then guardsmen planted Peter's niece Anna Ivanovna on the throne. During her rule, her favorite Biron practically ruled the country. After Anna's death, for a short time baby Ivan Antonovich was declared the emperor, with his mother and Anna Ivanovna's niece, Anna Leopoldovna, as regent. The guards successfully dethroned him and enthroned Peter's daughter, Elizaveta, who did not have children. Elizabeth's rule lasted 20 years, and after her death, Peter III ascended to the throne. He was Elizaveta's nephew, and he married the German princess Friederike Usta-Angold-Sepsky, who received the name Ekaterina, or Catherine in Russia. The guards did not like Peter. Eventually, guardsmen dethroned and killed the unlucky emperor, and they made Catherine, who they did like, the Russian Tsarina. Empress Catherine II, subsequently also called Catherine the Great. So, in 75 years, there were 8 rulers, Shakespearean passions, intrigues, treachery, favorites, traitors, valorous guardsmen, revolutions, and all of this in the higher echelons of power. Nevertheless, the country continued to move on the course that Peter had set for. Russia waged wars both in the west and the south. A series of Russian-Turkish wars resulted in the Russian Empire annexing Crimea and the northern Black Sea coast, having at last gained access to the warm waters of the Mediterranean Sea. The Russian army also battled successfully on the country's western boundaries. Lithuania, Belarusia, and the western areas of Ukraine became parts of Russia as the result of several divisions of Poland. A broad wave of European culture washed over Russia, changing not only the appearance of people and city streets, it also changed the intellectual atmosphere in the country. After the Moscow University, which was already established in Elizaveta's time, a number of educational institutions opened in the capital of St. Petersburg. As a result, the number of educated people familiar with the most exalted aspects of world culture increased, as did the number of highly professional experts. Catherine II managed to some extent to return the monarchy to its former glory. She also took some steps to further Europeanize and humanize Russian life.
Россия есть страна великая, единая и неделимая. Россия – держава, суть европейская, а граждане российские – суть европейцы. Не рабы, а мои подданные – свободные граждане.
However, a peasant revolt led by Yelemyan Pugachev so frightened the empress that during her rule, she curtailed her liberal projects, of which there were many. In particular, she wanted to finally create a new code of laws. But the society's energy shifted from lawmaking to wars, in which new Russian commanders distinguished themselves, particularly Admiral Ushakov and Count Suvorov. The empress ruled for more than 30 years, was considered educated, and corresponded with French philosophers and encyclopedists. Catherine's years of rule are sometimes called the Golden Age. Catherine's son Pavel inherited the throne after the death of his mother. During her lifetime, she did not let him be privy to state affairs, considering him to be not so clever and competent. After his ascension to the throne, he immediately started to eradicate any free thinking. He introduced strict censorship, forbade Russian citizens to study abroad, and foreigners to freely enter Russia. In general, he was extravagant and mentally not well adjusted.
Дворцовых фаворитов и угодников вон! Отныне крестьяне будут работать на бар своих не более 3 дней в неделю. Казенную службу начинать с 6, нет, с 5 часов поутру. Берегитесь, лукавцы!
Some of his acts shocked his contemporaries. He severed diplomatic relations with England and sent 40 regiments of the Don Cossacks to conquer India with neither maps nor an action plan. Some of the new emperor's acts and decisions were so ridiculous and silly that eventually the Guards' patience ended, and as a result, they hatched a plot in which Pavel's son Alexander participated. Pavel was killed, and the successor Alexander became the emperor. Alexander began his rule by canceling the decrees of his father, returning many of the wrongly punished from exile. In general, the young emperor intended to carry out various liberal reforms. At this time, in the early 19th century, Russia was already a powerful realm, which included huge swaths of Eastern Europe, Northern Asia, and even Alaska. The country's population was about 70 million. Russia's foreign policy in the early 19th century was defined by opposition to Napoleonic France. Consequently, the Russian army, which was used to waging wars of aggression, had to wage a defensive war for the first time. After a series of battles and truces, a 600,000-strong French army led by Napoleon crossed the borders of Russia and moved in the direction of Moscow. The Russian commanders, Barclay de Tolly, Bagration, and the legendary commander-in-chief, Kutuzov, used very sly tactics in war with Napoleon. They did not enter into decisive battles and full frontal assaults, but retreated, trying to squelch the French on the roads, where they would not have enough transport or rations, in the hopes that the French army would lose its power on the huge open plains of Russia. Only when the French reached the settlement of Borodino near Moscow did a great battle come about in which neither side was able to gain a decisive victory. The Russian army, having weakened the French, nevertheless gave them their former capital, Moscow. There, the conquerors did not manage to celebrate the triumph as there was a large fire. The now weakened and anemic French army was compelled to leave Moscow and all but flee back from where they came. The Russian commander's plan worked brilliantly. The lagging French army was attacked continually by guerrillas. As a result of this campaign, a considerable number of the 600,000 French soldiers died on Russian soil. The results of this war were disputed. In France, it was considered as yet another victorious campaign, since the French occupied the capital of Russia, did not lose a single battle. Russian historians have more of a basis to claim victory, since the enemy was expelled from the country. Well, and Russian society of that time certainly considered it a victory and felt a huge surge of patriotism. Within a period of 2 years and after a number of bloody battles, Russian forces, together with their allies Prussia, Austria, and England, invaded France and captured Paris. Having passed through all of Europe, Russian officers who were basically representatives of aristocratic and noble families have brought their free-thinking ideas back with them from their campaigns in Europe. Secret societies formed, the goals of which were to modernize Russia in any number of ways. In 1825, when Emperor Alexander died, he did not have a successor. In view of his brother Constantine's refusal to ascend to the throne, Alexander's other brother Nicholas was declared. Conspirators took advantage of the situation and deployed the army to Palace Square in St. Petersburg. The Guards regiments swore allegiance to Emperor Constantine instead of the declared Emperor Nicholas. Although the revolt, which was named the Revolt of the Decembrists, failed, and its leaders were either hanged or exiled to Siberian penal servitude, the value for Russian history of this first revolt against absolute monarchy is difficult to overestimate. Nicholas I consistently struggled against these ideas, which penetrated the country on a wind of freedom and change. During his 30 years of rule, he created an ideal absolute monarchy, an authoritative regime in the military mold, with strict submission and control, universal surveillance with secret police, censorship, and limited admittance to universities to reduce the number of educated and free-thinking people. Nicholas's German origins perhaps played a role in his prosperity for order and control, and all of this was multiplied by the Russian traditions of autocracy and absolute power.
Ваше Величество, в том и несчастье, что вы все можете, что вы выше закона. А я желал бы, чтобы ваши подданные зависели от закона, а не от вашей угодности, капризов или минутных настроений.
заковать в железо, содержать как злодея.
Authoritarian thinking also affected foreign policy. Russia was a strong European power, influencing the course of world events. Consequently, Russia was not without justification named the gendarme of Europe. Having started another Russo-Turkish war, Nicholas faced direct confrontation with the European powers. Connected by allied obligations with Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, England and France sent their armies to the Black Sea and inflicted a humiliating defeat on Russia during the Crimean War. The entire course and results of the Crimean War made it obvious that there was a deep crisis in Russia. In society, there were intense discussions and soul-searching, and different understandings emerged of the goals and paths of Russia in relation to the rest of the world. Basically, this discourse was a continuation of the constant dispute between East and the West, the notorious Europe-Asia pendulum. Against a backdrop of such moods, Tsar Nicholas's son Alexander II ascended to the throne and issued a manifesto announcing the end of serfdom in Russia, freeing the indentured peasants. That is why Alexander II came to be known as the Tsar Liberator. The new Tsar began to actively implement judicial, land ownership, and military reforms. It seemed that the centuries-old dream had come true. Not really. To some, the reforms seemed radical, and to others they were too mild and insufficiently decisive. And Russia came to be continually rattled by the shots of the insurgents killing representatives of authorities, right up to the highest levels of power. Now, Russian students could already teach the European teachers a thing or two about how to organize a terrorist struggle. The Tsar Liberator was caught in a crossfire between conservatives, liberals, and leftist radicals. During his rule, he was shot at, bombs were detonated in the palace, a bomb was planted on the imperial train, and at last, in 1881, death overtook him on the bank of the Catherine Canal in St. Petersburg. Terrorist threats forced the following Tsar, Alexander III, the son of Alexander II, to lodge far away from Petersburg in the well-protected Gatchina Palace. Probably society's reaction to his father's reforms affected the new emperor so severely that during his rule he swung in the opposite direction. His ideal was the strong power of a Tsar who the people considered to be their father. His rule can be characterized as a victory for conservatism. The reforms stopped and the legal force of some liberal laws was limited. A policy of oppression and national minorities was pursued. If, in a political and public sense, it was possible by any measure to call Russia a backward country, in the fields of culture, science, and literature, it excelled. It is enough to name the names of such writers as Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, composers such as Glinka, Rimsky-Korsakov, Mussorgsky, and Tchaikovsky, scientists such as Stoletov, Yablokov, Tsiolkovsky, and Lobachevsky. They are outstanding figures in theater, musicians, artists, actors, directors, and ballet dancers, scores and hundreds of names. They also created the glory of Russia as a great cultural power. Perhaps Alexander III's son Nicholas II was the most unfortunate Russian Tsar. Being born the successor of the throne weighed heavily upon him. He was afraid of the prospect of being the emperor. He felt that the scale of his personality was incomparable to that of the country. Besides, the new monarch was pursued by troubles from the very beginning. The festivities in honor of his coronation in Kudinsky Field in Moscow ended in a terrible stampede in which hundreds of people died. Nicholas's wife Alexandra was a German princess who gave birth to a successor with a serious blood ailment, and the personal grief of the parents affected their governing. Thus it came to be that the half-monk, half-sorcerer Grigory Rasputin was called in to treat the successor. Rasputin exerted tremendous influence on the Tsar and Tsarina. Russian society thirsted for changes, and after the lost war with Japan, the first workers' revolts took place in the Far East, presaging the revolution. The revolts were suppressed, but discontent among the people fomented. The frightened Tsar lashed about and went to extremes. At first, he implemented democratic reforms by convening a parliament known as the Duma, but then he dissolved it. He appointed a prime minister only to later dismiss him. He granted concessions, but then authorized drastic measures against rebels. Despite the boiling of public passions, an untold cultural renaissance was taking place in Russia. The capitals, St. Petersburg and Moscow, amazed with the brilliance of their aristocratic and artistic salons. There were remarkable figures who made contributions not only to domestic but also world culture. To name only a few, the composers Scriabin and Rachmaninoff, the artists Wrubel, Malevich, and Kandinsky, the great reformer of world theater Stanislavski, Diaghilev's revolutionary ballet troupe, the scientists Mechnikov and Pavlov. And behind them stood hundreds of the most talented people, most of whom were unfortunately compelled to emigrate from their native land. At the same time, 90% of the population of huge Russian Empire from Poland to Sakhalin consisted of illiterate and poorly clothed people that were hardly making ends meet. It was in such conditions that in 1914 Russia, allied with England and France, entered the war with Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The great senseless war on the European continent, in which millions of lives were lost, brought nothing but grief and the suffering to the participating countries. At first, war went well for Russia, but in 1915-16, there was a series of defeats caused mainly by bad organization, terrible logistics, and the low morale of an army consisting of former peasants who did not understand the purposes of the war and why they should give their lives. The general discontent with the imperial power led to revolutionary expulsion in Petersburg, which in February 1917 was renamed Petrograd. As a result, Tsar Nicholas II was abdicated and became the last Russian Tsar from the Romanov dynasty and the last Russian emperor in general. The provisional government, formed from representatives of different parties, came to power. Soldiers, tired of war and the demoralized population both in the cities and the villages, perceived the calls for revolution more and more. Many heads of the extremist and terrorist organizations who were previously in the underground returned from abroad. One of these organizations was the Marxist grouping of communists known as the Bolsheviks, headed by a fanatical, resolute, and energetic leader, Vladimir Ulyanov, who subsequently came to be known around the world under his party nickname, Lenin. The Bolsheviks defiantly seized power in Petersburg, having occupied the Winter Palace practically without a shot. The Democratic Provisional Government was meeting there, and the Bolsheviks arrested its members. The ideal and goal of the Bolsheviks was worldwide revolution that stopped at nothing: murders, executions of innocent people, betrayal of former colleagues. From 1917 to 1920, there was a civil war in Russia. This war, as a matter of fact, was a mass national slaughter, with millions of lives lost. And as often happens in similar cases in history, it ended with victory for the cruelest and most cynical group. In this case, the Bolsheviks won. In 1920, after the end of the Civil War, Bolsheviks began to build a paradise on earth, having begun with building communism, a society of happiness in one captured country. But this country laid in ruins, and everywhere there was hunger, ruin, and illness. It was necessary to somehow put things in order, provide the country with food and essential commodities. Lenin made a decisive step and declared the new economic policy, which at least gave small enterprises some measure of economic freedom and a capitalist, in minimal doses, market economy. Talk about a miracle. In 2 to 3 years, the country changed. After the hunger and tortures of civil war, there were groceries, clothes, and even luxury goods. The country revived. There was a new class of small property owners. All of this irritated a considerable part of Lenin's entourage, the die-hard Bolsheviks. After the death of Lenin in 1924, Joseph Jugashvili, more commonly known under his party nickname Stalin, seized power even more decisively. He was a former seminary student who spent his youth in the underground cells of leftist groups. Stalin was a refined intriguer and amazed even those who considered him a close colleague with his treachery. But, being at first very popular in the party, he managed to organize a faction against his equally popular rival, known as the Builder of the Red Army, the remarkable orator, organizer, and extreme left ideologist Leon Trotsky. The rivalry ended with Trotsky's exile from the country and his eventual murder. Stalin seized the secret police, the Cheka, and set in motion a series of show trials against practically all leaders of Bolsheviks who had supervised the revolution. By 1929, Stalin had completely seized control over the country. He expropriated land from the peasants and drove them into cooperatives, so-called collective farms. Rich peasants, the so-called kulaks, were executed or forced into Siberian exile. The collectivization of agriculture led to unprecedented famine. Millions of peasants died. It was one of the greatest tragedies in Stalin's time in office. Having imposed unreasonable taxes on the peasantry, Stalin raised funds for the country's industrialization. Power stations and factories were promptly erected and mines were excavated. The country changed rapidly. It was the ideal totalitarian state with full control over all aspects of life, even over people's thoughts. In the conditions of total ideological control, a new type of person was created, the Homo Sovieticus, who was an obedient small screw in the huge state machinery. Any dissent and even suspicion of dissent was punished most severely. People were killed or imprisoned for a slow death in Siberia in the country's north. The prisoners' slave labor was used to build a new state, for building a bright future. The heads of the armed forces, marshals and generals, most of the officers of the Red Army were executed. After torture, all of them confessed to absolutely improbable crimes: espionage, sabotage, treason. At this time in Europe, the Nazi regime, which was led by another ruthless dictator, Adolf Hitler, began to gather strength. Hitler managed to deceive his rival. In 1939, Germans waged war in Europe, preliminarily having concluded a non-aggression pact with Russia. But Hitler hoodwinked Stalin, and in 1941, prefiditiously attacked the Soviet Union. Stalin hastened to form an alliance with those already at war against Germany, England and the United States. The anti-Hitler coalition formed. Having been deprived of skilled military leaders and officers with combat experience, the Red Army was at first completely disorganized and retreated almost all the way to the Volga in panic. But the Russian people showed unprecedented persistence and patriotism. Bearing incalculable losses, it is considered that Russia lost about 20 million people in World War II. The Red Army gradually became truly national and managed to change the course of the war. After the battles of Stalingrad and Kursk, the ensuing counterattack resulted not only in the liberation of all the occupied territories of the Soviet Union beginning, but also in military actions in Germany. In 1945, the Allies celebrated a historic victory in World War II. The prize in this victory for the Soviet Union was not only the return of Soviet territory, but also the countries of Eastern Europe, which Germany gave up under the terms of its surrender. In 1949, after the war with Japan, besides Russia, China and North Korea joined the so-called socialist map. Consequently, a huge communist empire that operated from Moscow was formed. This resulted in a confrontation with Western countries led by the US, which was represented in Soviet propaganda as the ultimate evil. There were times when the conflict threatened to turn into World War III with the use of nuclear weapons. At that time, the huge Soviet propaganda apparatus created the cult of Stalin, the great leader and the father of the people of all progressive mankind, endowed with unreal abilities. And here at the peak of power and glory, Stalin died, according to some sources, liquidated by conspirators from his inner circle. Even in death, the leader, the tyrant, and the murderer claimed more victims. Thousands of people died in a stampede during his funeral. It is paradoxical, but the influence of propaganda penetrated the consciousness so deeply that most people mourned over his death and continued to love him for many years. As the result of a short struggle for the power after the liquidation of State Security Minister Lavrentiy Beria, the pragmatist Nikita Khrushchev came to power. At first, he operated by using Stalin's methods to get rid of all of his colleagues in the Politburo, but nobody was persecuted. In addition, having attained political power, he gave a historical address detailing Stalin's crimes at the 20th Party Congress. In general, Khrushchev was not too educated and was rather inconsistent, sometimes allowing himself quite exotic actions, like attempting to sow the entire country with corn or pounding on a table with his shoe at the General Assembly of the United Nations. But during his time in office, the first man-made satellite was launched, as well as the first manned spaceflight, carried out by the first cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin. He brought the country to the brink of World War with the Berlin and Cuban Missile Crisis, but was also the first Soviet head of state to visit America. During his time in office, there was a so-called Khrushchev thaw, when more liberal conventions became possible in literature and art, and the names of new young writers, artists, musicians became known. And, having been frightened, Khrushchev restored the rigid party control over this sphere of life. He promised to bury America, and in a flash of enlightenment, he decided to get rid of the domination of the party nomenclatura, for which this nomenclatura discharged him from power in 1964. Led by Leonid Brezhnev, the conspirators against Khrushchev took control of the government, and the subsequent years became known as the era of stagnation. The basic idea of the almost 20-year period, when party officials, generals, and the strengthened KGB was in power, consisted in protecting what they inherited, the preservation of the Red Empire. Therefore, confrontation with the West continued. The Cold War ebbed and flowed. The national economy mostly depended on the sale of raw materials to the West, mainly oil. And when Ronald Reagan came to power in the US, with exacerbating of the arms race and oil prices rapidly falling, a most severe economic crisis came about. Brezhnev died in 1982. The increasingly decrepit leadership at first put forward the influential former head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov, to replace Brezhnev. After Andropov's death, there was one more elderly leader, Chernenko, who also soon died. These were infirm old people. It was obvious that the country needed a young leader. The old men in the leadership were compelled to call Mikhail Gorbachev to power, and he energetically got down to business, quickly changed the party leadership and the government, and began to carry out reforms. The course of so-called perestroika, or reorganization, was declared, meaning reorganization of the country's public and governmental order.
А то все говорят, а что такое перестройка? Что такое перестройка? Свое дело делать честно. Главная перестройка.
The people liked the young leader. He could speak without reading from a piece of paper, and he held promise. He established partner relations with the West. East Germany and the so-called socialist countries found freedom during the Gorbachev era. Gorbachev's liberal reforms naturally caused discontent among conservative circles, the same army, KGB, and the economic branch of the government. In 1991, they staged a coup. There were tanks on the streets of Moscow. Despite the fact that practically the entire leadership at the time participated in the plot, the putsch ended in utter defeat because the conspirators had no plan or any real offers of change for the better. The putsch left the country practically without leadership, which the increasingly bolder heads of the national republics used to their advantage. The republics seceded and became independent of Russia. The paradox of history that was upon returning to Moscow, the triumphant Gorbachev turned out to be the president of a now non-existent country and the favorite of the people. Boris Yeltsin became the new president of Russia at the time. Undoubtedly, Yeltsin's first merit is that given the general disorder, he did not resort to military confrontation with the former republics or with the conservative communist opposition. It was a peaceful dismantling of the empire.
Мы все сделали выбор в пользу мирного, правового, демократического способа преобразований.
Yeltsin's second undoubtable merit was that his time in office was a time of freedom and a celebration of democracy. After the times of totalitarianism and the era of stagnation, most people were shocked at the freedom which spread across the country. Society broke into two, and supporters of the former regime and any and all conservatives and nationalists were in the majority. Yeltsin had to overcome a set of crises and even an armed rebellion in 1993. Nevertheless, he manifested outstanding political instincts, decisiveness, and sometimes also cunning, so he was able to cope with situations without reprisals. The pro-communist parliament deprived him of practically half his power and budgetary funds. Therefore, Yeltsin was forced to ask for support to a number of new capitalists who had grown rich in these nebulous times. When it seemed that the majority of difficulties were in the past and the country was moving forward, a financial crisis developed and resulted in a default. Bankruptcy, loss of bank deposits, companies stopping operations, and non-payment of salaries created a good opportunity for the opposition to attack. Perhaps such a skilled politician as Yeltsin would again find a way out, but under the Constitution, the second term of his presidency came to an end in 2000, and the neo-communists could surely come to power. And even in this situation, Yeltsin shows his exclusive political acumen one last time. he appoints himself a successor, former KGB officer Vladimir Putin. Exhausted with constant confrontation between executive power and parliament, the constant tension and conflicts, society enthusiastically supported the new president.
Из этого кабинета видно, что наша страна нуждается в реконструкции для того, чтобы иметь будущее.
In his first term as head of state, Putin basically continued Yeltsin's policies, but gradually he began to show greater and greater independence. Circumstances developed in the best way for him. In parliament, the majorities belonged to his supporters. Putin settled the conflict of the Chechen Republic. Putin's 8 years in office were a fortuitous time for Russia. In 2009, Putin transferred the power of president to Dmitry Medvedev and himself assumed the post of prime minister. He remains an influential leader. Let us hope and believe that the mighty power of Russia will only have good luck in the future.